This presentation is going to cover history and tactics of Abrahamism, and if you're new to our work, you will be surprised that I will not be covering only the 3 Abrahamic religions, but I trust it will all make sense in the end. Abrahamism, as we use it, is not a term for a single group strategy, but a set of tactics shared by different groups across different time periods for different purposes, named as such both because the 3 Abrahamic religions exemplify it, but also because so does the character of Abraham himself. I need to preface this by saying that I will not be presenting the following narrative with absolute certainty of everything I say, and that all of my opinions may not be shared by other fellows. My goal is to present as best understanding of this history as I currently have and can fit into my allotted time, and I apologize that I will not be giving most of these topics space they would individually deserve. And will, especially in the modern era, be skipping over a lot, with the intention being only to show the origins, the shared threads, and where we are today. The intent is not to blame anyone, merely to understand the strategy so we may become resistant. Contrary to what you'd expect, we will not be starting with Abraham, and will instead be going to ancient Sparta. Spartans are most associated with discipline, heroism, and fanatical zeal, but what we need to understand here is the conditions at home produced by the law of mythical Lycurgus. First characteristic was radical egalitarianism, every citizen getting the same share of land and property allotted. No one was to act in self-interest, all was to be motivated by shared benefit. Currency was made of iron to make it impractical to carry around in large quantities, and unacceptable in other states, isolating Sparta from foreign goods and making it impossible for the rich to have any meaningful advantage over the poor. All superfluous arts and luxuries were banned, privacy was effectively outlawed, with everyone forced to eat prescribed meals in common. Women were forced to take on masculine sports such as wrestling to exercise tenderness out of them, and both sexes would be naked at processions and festivals, with women shaming the manhood of those whose conduct in war was not up to standard. Marriage was promoted by forcing old unmarried men into naked processions in winter while singing self-degrading songs. Brides had their hair shaved and got dressed in men's clothes for their wedding night, with the bridegroom going back to sleeping with other men afterwards and only meeting with their wives when unobserved, often in the dark. At the same time, providing access to wives to other fit men was seen as honorable. Children were not seen as property of their parents, but of the state, and upon birth were carried to be examined by the elders, who decided to assign fit ones to be brought up in one of the other households and unfit ones to be thrown into chasm. From 7-year-olds, all boys would be educated in the same school to ensure ideological conformity and following of orders. From 12 years old, they had no shoes, a single coat for a year, with beds reserved for only a few days each, slept outside, and only being given a very small allowance of food, being expected to steal the rest without threat of whipping should they be caught. All of this was running on agricultural slave labor of the Helots. Sparta was a completely synthetic society without any connection to history before the law of Lycurgus got imposed, and it's unclear whether Lycurgus was even real or invented as a later justification. Its laws were artificially made up with political goals as opposed to naturally emerging via people negotiating and eliminating antisocial behavior. With norms of Sparta established, we are moving to Athens, a participatory government of all free adult male citizens, only interrupted and replaced during and after the Peloponnesian War by oligarchic revolutions. It is before Peloponnesian War that Socrates was teaching the youths, and whilst we know little about the details of his teaching beyond different pictures painted by his defenders and his critics, we understand that he was deviating significantly from the traditional religion and worship of the Pantheon, claimed to have his own communication with God, developed his own personal system of morality and taught his students to question traditional authority. At least 3 of his students, Alcibiades, Charmides, and Critias, turned into Spartan collaborators during the war. The last became one of the 30 tyrants, the oligarchs chosen to manage Athens after its loss. Critias was a militant atheist who believed religion has only ever been a means to control the masses, and unleashed terror in his war on traditional religion to bring about his utopian vision, and had no scruples about any action that would lead there, having no moral code to restrain his actions. The rule of him and the other oligarchs was a complete failure. They were eventually overthrown by democrats who regrouped in exile. Democracy and all traditions were restored, and Socrates promptly condemned to death for a vague charge of corrupting the youth, with specific of his crimes not mentioned in the charge due to general amnesty. It is in this context that a relative of Critias and Charmides and another student of Socrates, Aristocles, known by his wrestle nickname Platon, starts developing his philosophy and his own utopian political vision. Plato's philosophy exists exclusively in the form of Socratic dialogues, where the vehicle for Plato's philosophy is a fictional portrayal of Socrates who typically confronts, likewise fictional portrayal of other citizens of Athens who badly argue strawmen of various moral or political positions, with Socrates asking leading questions that produce either no resolution at all, leaving everyone confused, or gets the interlocutors to agree with Socrates on Plato's positions. On other occasions, he seemingly hides its real position within speeches of the Socrates' opponents. We will not be going over metaphysics such as theory of forms. Our interest is in the primary political works, those being the Republic and the laws. The propositions in the Republic clearly demonstrate infatuation with the Spartan system, such as women and children as shared property of the state, with children ignorant of their biological parents and parents of children. Pairs were to be chosen for reproduction by the rulers to achieve eugenic breeding. Indoctrination of children would start from early years. Traditional religion with imperfect and capricious gods, including Homer's works, was to be rejected, outlawed, and replaced by entirely good gods. Citizens would be made to accept their predetermined social roles using a noble lie. This inclusion was conceivably a reaction to the failure of Critias' atheist rule. All imitative arts was to be banned. Slavery was only allowable if the subjects were non-Greeks. All of this is managed and enforced by an unimpeachable philosopher king with a class of guardian enforcers, effectively putting Plato's class into dominance over the whole project. There was to be no need for a rule of law, as indoctrinated citizens would never act unlawfully. The city technically serves as a metaphor for the soul, but this being the idea of a perfect city, to represent the perfect soul, nonetheless tells us a lot. The last, in contrast, is the only surviving dialogue not to feature Socrates, his role replaced by Athenian stranger, and deviates from the design of the city of the Republic in various respects, being more realistic, allowing some private property and private families, and having written laws, most of the dialogue covering those. Of mention are also Timaeus, describing the whole world designed by a single god, the Demiurge, Phaedo concerning immortality of the soul, and Gorgias, which contains the judgment of the bare souls, sending sinful ones to Tartarus, and virtuous ones to the Isle of the Blessed. Plato was known to burn books of other philosophers rather than even trying to compete on some supposed marketplace of ideas. His own philosophy continued to inspire generations of philosophers following him, but he didn't live to see his political system put into practice. And this is where we move to the ancient history of the Jewish people. Insofar we can trace it back. It appears the kingdoms of Israel and Judah emerged in hills of Canaan out of Canaanite civilization in 10th century BC, or earlier, at a time when Canaan itself has already been weakened and largely abandoned, with Jerusalem then being but a small unfortified town. The Canaanites that didn't become Israelites were absorbed into Philistines and Phoenicians. At the time, Israelites still continued to partake in Canaanite polytheistic religion, with Yahweh gaining ascendancy over other Canaanite gods, though at the time being nothing like we know, for instance, still having a consort Asherah. In the 8th century, kingdom of Israel fell to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, whereas Judah became a vassal state and continued growing until the end of 7th century, when Assyria in turn collapsed, and Judah, including the temple in Jerusalem, got destroyed in competition between Neo-Babylonian Empire and Egypt. Aaronite priests of the temple at Bethel in Benjamin are gaining prestige during this period, while Zadokites of Jerusalem are in exile, formulating the basis of the unique religion, informed by their views on now-felt kingship, their nation, and divinity. This is where the earliest books of the Bible, the books of prophets, as well as the basis of the historical books, such as the probably entirely fictitious history of the united monarchy of Solomon and David, originate from. Notable patterns are justification of Yahwist, monopoly of control, every act of kings that promoted worship of other gods or deviated from priests' preferences portrayed as evil in the eyes of the Lord, an emphasis on distinct Jewish identity, differentiating itself from all others by costly traditions such as circumcision and observance of Sabbath. In the 6th century, Persia conquered Babylon, and exiles were allowed to return to Jerusalem and build a second temple. Ideological views of the exiles subsequently got imposed on the rest of the population. Yahweh is deceitfully presented to the Persian as a universal god, same as their own Ahura Mazda, while internally he remains understood as a tribal god. Persia itself gets conquered by Alexander the Great at the end of 4th century, and the Jewish region becomes part of Ptolemaic kingdom and later Seleucid Empire, followed by Maccabean revolt against Seleucid in the middle of the 2nd century, becoming semi-autonomous under Hasmonean dynasty, only to become a vassal state of Roman Republic in 1st century BC and province of the empire at the turn of the millennium. It was under Ptolemies that Jews are coming under influence of Hellenic philosophy, and it is at this time that the Library of Alexandria is getting built under Ptolemy II. The narrative goes that he tried to collect every possible text in the world and get it translated to Greek, and that he asked 72 Hebrew translators to provide translation of Jewish law known as Septuagint. However, we have good reasons to believe much of it was invented on the spot. Pentateuch and some of the following books bear clear marks of Hellenic and particularly Platonic influence. The creation story appears to be inspired by the creation narrative presented in Timaeus more so than any other known creation story. Yahweh becoming Plato's demiurge, a universal creator god, despite still acting as a Jewish tribal god everywhere else throughout the text. The character of Moses performed the same role as Lycurgus, a mythical lawgiver who was given the law from God a millennium ago, a narrative invented to make people accept something that has only just been invented to justify rule of the priests, in the place of Plato's philosophers. Laws of Moses bear clear marks of being derived from Plato's laws, but taking the idea still farther by attributing them to God, making them unchangeable and thus impossible for Israelites to adapt to new circumstances. Judges are similarly inspired by Greek heroes. Samson is Heracles, all the way to his end by female deceit. Gideon and his army of 300 is Leonidas. Other sources include Sumerian flood myth we can find in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or myth of Sargon being led down the river in a basket as a child, inspiring Moses. Study of Exodus is likely a reaction to history written by Egyptian priest Manetho, where he describes the invasion of Semitic people Hyksos who tried to take over Egypt and were chased out by Pharaoh and his son. It's evident that the prophets of the earlier books had no knowledge of any of these myths. Many of these similarities were already seen at the time, but the explanation of biblical adherence has been that it was the Greeks who stole from the Jews rather than vice versa. Whereas the Platonic project was justified by supposed internal good of the society, the project of these Jewish priests was quite a bit grander, and we'll demonstrate this by going over what the text is teaching. The story of Adam and Eve involves an evidently not omniscient Yahweh who bans first humans or any case first Jews, from gaining knowledge via eating a fruit from a specific tree. A snake appears and tells Eve that Yahweh is lying to them and they will be like gods upon eating the fruit, attaining knowledge of good and evil. They do, and it turns out Yahweh was indeed lying when they don't die and attain the knowledge. Yahweh nonetheless kicks them out of Eden for this. This story teaches the Jews to put faith only in Yahweh's representatives and distrust foreigners who may be trying to teach them different knowledge, especially morality that contradicts the priest's teachings. The story of Abram in Egypt is that of him prostituting his sister wife Sarai to Pharaoh with plausible deniability, with the Pharaoh getting punished by Yahweh for sleeping with her rather than renamed Abraham for lying. His grandson Jacob scams his brother Esau out of his birthright by deceiving his father. This is treated as an entirely legitimate way to obtain something, and Jacob is rewarded by becoming Israel, the father of the whole Jewish nation. His son Joseph conspires with the Egyptian government, excessively taxing the Egyptians of their grain, only to subsequently use a famine to get them to sell him all their property and then themselves into slavery in exchange for getting some of their own grain back. Jews that afterwards settle in Egypt are supposedly then enslaved for no reason at all other than Egyptians being mean. Yahweh hardening Pharaoh's heart later in the Exodus is among the examples of Gentiles being mere puppets to teach Jews lessons rather than having their own free will. Of note is the book of Esther, where a Jewish woman marries into a Persian royal family and manipulates the king for the benefit of her nation. As for the character of Yahweh, despite supposedly being a creator of all nations in the world, he is a jealous God and demonstrates total hatred and contempt for them and commands his chosen to destroy their places of worship, much like Critias did before, and often to outright exterminate the entire populations in conquered territories. Such victims include Canaanites, Midianites, inhabitants of Madekah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, and Hazor, and Amalekites. Jews are forbidden to make any pacts with Gentile nations and their gods, effectively making cooperative relations impossible. This is part of Yahweh's covenant with the Jews, which demands exclusive worship and unquestioning obeisance of his commands in exchange for them forever remaining separate and gaining total supremacy over the rest of mankind. They are promised a country with great and prosperous cities they have not built, with houses full of good things they have not provided, with wells they have not dug, with vineyards and olive trees they have not planted. They are promised sucking on milk of nations and the blood of kings, to be creditors to many nations and ruled by none. The strategy is self-reinforcing. Whenever victories are gained, that is evidence of Yahweh's blessings and he needs to be worshipped harder. Whenever losses are experienced, that is the evidence of disobedience and Yahweh needs to be worshipped harder and his commands obeyed more accurately. The book of Job teaches not to question Yahweh regardless of how cruel his actions and decisions are. A thread of messianism runs through the text, first referring to Cyrus as the Messiah and later promising a future Messiah from the Davidic line who would restore Israel and bring about what's promised in the covenant. What we are looking at in the Tanakh, known to Christians as the Old Testament, is nothing other than an application of a Platonic political program for Jewish parasitic world domination with their priesthood at the top. The entire ideology is completely materialistic. Throughout the whole text, there is no signs of souls or afterlife. Sheol appears to be nothing but a literal burial in the ground, where other gods reside in the heaven and rewards or punishments are promised in the hereafter. Jewish gods resides on earth and promises the material rewards in this life. The only immortality Jews are promised is that of their nation as a whole. The so maligned worship of idols of other nations also points to this. The claim being that literal stone and wood are being worshipped rather than these serving as a symbolic connection to actual divinity. Judaism being the first proper Abrahamic ideology, we will examine it as a group strategy. The nature of the entirety of Semitic people appears to be feminine, as even Aesop attests in one of his usually ignored fables where Arabs steal out the lies Hermes was trying to distribute around the world. And it is this feminine nature that is appealed to. Extreme collectivism, simply following an authority, not having to make any moral judgments beyond a very simple one. We're good, everyone else is evil. If it's good for us, it's moral. Getting status and power over others and exploiting them without any sense of responsibility, all things very attractive to a feminine mind. The very notion of being the chosen people serves to maintain cohesion, because why would any feminine individual want to defect from the highest status people in the world? Ideological conformity is enforced via feminine means of coercion. Deviation leads to ostracization, and again, you don't want to be ostracized from the chosen, do you? Status within the group goes to the priesthood, that is to the most verbally skilled members who can best justify the ideology. Next typical feature of Abrahamism is universalism. It can never be simply an organization for some isolated groups that keeps to itself, demands taking over the world and changing it. It's not universalistic in the sense of everyone in the world being part of the same group if they believe the same things, as some of the subsequent ideologies would be. So perhaps the more familiar term is globalism. Finally, we identify seduction with a false promise of freedom from laws of nature as shared thread through Abrahamistic ideologies, and yet Judaism is the biggest outlier among those, because if we look at the state of the world, Yahweh's promise is evidently getting delivered on exactly as promised. Unsurprisingly, a psychopathic behavior of such a strategy leads to hatred from other nations, and Jewish feminine minds, unable to systematize causality and take responsibility, take this as an irrational prejudice towards them, and in a typical feminine fashion, everyone else is accused of trying to genocide them despite their own religion being the only explicitly genocidal one. Continuing Jewish history where we ended, it wasn't only Israelites who came under Hellenic and Roman dominion, but so did their Canaan descended cousins, Phoenicians, including their empire of Carthage in the Punic Wars. These were largely mercantile cosmopolitan populations and could very well have been sympathetic to Israelites due to hatred of their shared enemy and the messianic promises. It seems highly likely that these populations contributed millions of converts to Judaism, not experiencing the usual entry costs due to already practicing circumcision, the irony of Canaanites thus becoming the new Israelites notwithstanding. This new Jew easily outnumbered the original Israelite stock and quickly became elites of the region due to their already accumulated wealth and expertise in mercantilism. They brought in their own religious traditions and symbols, like the Star of Saturn, and somehow managed to reconcile them with the Israelite Holy Book, giving us the origin of rabbinical Judaism and sects such as Pharisees. Most of the Jews we'll be speaking of from here on out originate from this population, including Ashkenazim and Sephardim, whose progenitors were males of this stock, mixing with converted North Italian and Spanish women respectively. Time to get into Christianity. We don't really know what happened, whether Jesus was real, and if so, whether his characterization in the text is anything close to the inspiration, but it's clear the origin of Christianity as an ideology and the movement can be traced to Saul of Tarsus, known as Paul the Apostle. Paul appears to have been trying to get out of the bind of Judaism. In a letter to Galatians, he even refers to it as a curse of the law. A popular belief at this time was the so-called Gnosticism. This is a post-hoc name invented in the 19th century by German sociologists. Nobody at the time called himself agnostic, but there is nonetheless a clear strain of thought found in Nag Hammadi library that recognized Yahweh's character for what he is, but unfortunately accepted his pretensions to being the demiurge and thus concluded material world must likewise be evil, and that there is another actual divinity that Christ represented. It emphasized attainment of spiritual knowledge to see through the illusion. Some of Paul's own beliefs may have originated there. Their notion of celestial Christ possibly only later got conflated with the human character of Jesus, and that his resurrection originally likely referred to an apotheosis, the Greek concept of transcending ordinary human life, and after that becoming divine. And it was influence of Jewish materialists that turned this into literal physical resurrection. Next to Gnostics, we have a faction of Romanized Jews who sided with the Romans in their conquest of Judea against the separatists, bought their freedom with accumulated treasure that presumably helped Vespasian come out victorious in the year of the four emperors, accepted that Roman military power can be resisted, and argued for assimilation while trying to produce favorable conditions for themselves in the empire. Among them Flavius Josephus, famous for his surviving history of the conflict with the Romans, as well as apologetics of the largely fictional or skewed Jewish history. It is reasonable to assume these prominent Jews would use their influence to manipulate Rome in the same way Babylonian exiles previously manipulated the Persians, and support development of a new ideology that is tolerant and supportive of the Jews. Likewise, the Roman emperor would have an interest in assimilating the Jews instead of them continuing in their separatist ways, and may have contributed to the development of Christianity. In the first half of the 2nd century, the first Christian canon compiled by Marcion of Sinope included Paul's letters along with the Gospel, now known as Gospel of Marcion, and no Old Testament, which Marcion, just like Paul and the Gnostic, regarded as evil. The Gospel of Marcion contains no references to the old Jewish religion, and while mainstream view is that Marcion edited Gospel of Luke to be in line with his beliefs, this remains contested, with the alternative views being independently based on an older source, or Marcion Gospel being the original and later getting injected with pro-Jewish elements. Some anti-Jewish themes have nonetheless persisted in the surviving Gospels, such as when Satan tempts Christ in Gospel of Matthew with the same pact that Yahweh has made with the Jews in the covenant. Meanwhile, Carthaginian converts gained a large influence in the Catholic Church, and these became the source of Judaization of Christianity, slandering the Gnostic faction as Manichaeans, and Tertullian calling Paul the father of all heresies. It is this faction that eventually won out the ideological battle in the way all these battles are, via networking and violence. And eventually it cemented its dominion in Council of Nicaea that declared one true Christian faith, including the logically incoherent concept of Trinity, and every alternative interpretation declared heretical. Canonical Book of Revelations in particular appears to be entirely Jewish, having little to do with Christ, some believing it refers to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Augustine of Hippo, another Carthaginian, later called Jews the older brothers in faith who must be protected by the church as such. Augustine also claimed that evil doesn't exist, that it's all part of God's plan, called the old gods demons, which was itself a subversion of Greek concept of daemon, and said that it doesn't matter if our earthly city is destroyed, since we'll be rewarded in heaven, the city of God, specifically referring to disintegration of the Western Empire in the 5th century. One might wonder whether he wasn't secretly happy about it. Where surviving Christian mythos is concerned, the life of Jesus is modeled on a typical Greek heroic myth, possibly also taking influence from Egyptian horrors, with the metaphysics of souls and afterlife much more familiar to Gentile peoples, taken once again from Plato's works. And this was among the reasons why it was able to gain so many European converts, along with prestige and connections that it started to represent. On the other hand, in a typical Platonist or Abrahamist fashion, there was increased suppression and oppression of those that held onto their old pre-Christian beliefs, with the word pagan originally being a slanderous term equivalent of a modern redneck or hick. The symbols and places of worship of the old order were defaced and destroyed by Christians, and books contradicting the biblical narrative burned. Any negative reaction to Christian behavior was turned into a martyrdom narrative without any mention of what was getting punished. The influence, however, went both ways. Christianity, Judaized as it was, became more pagan-like due to taking over existing Roman religious institutions, and later due to trying to convince Germanic peoples to convert, making Christianity more folkish and outward-looking, more in line with the spirit and strategy of European peoples, ensuring that Europe can remain successful civilization even under Christianity. This was in a sense a mirror image of the influence of Phoenician and Carthaginian converts on Judaism. All this only touches on the rabbit hole that is early history of Christianity and various competing theories that we could spend all day on, including a possible hoax of conversion of Emperor Constantine or influences of cults of Mithras and Sol Invictus, but the point is only to show development of Christianity was by no means straightforward, but a result of various competing factions with different beliefs and interests trying to attain domination, and this is probably why the narrative appears both pro-Jewish or anti-Jewish, depending on what part of text you're looking at. As a strategy, Christianity copies Judaism in various respects. All the feminine means of coercion are there, but at least in comparison, Christ's Sermon on the Mount is genuinely a largely actual moral teaching that motivates people to treat each other well, be forgiving, and take some responsibility. It is universalistic in a complete sense, breaking down tribal and familial loyalties, thus promoting extreme individualism and setting conversion of everyone in the world as a goal, justifying it as saving them. Christianity is stronger for this, but previously strong tribes are weakened due to having to be supportive of weaker peoples. Weakness in general is turned into a virtue. The false promises and false threats have all been moved to the afterlife. Jews during all this didn't all convert. Those that stuck with the old mix of Israelite and Canaanite religion developed a murderous hatred of Christianity for losing so many members of their tribe to it, and produced Talmud, a book that contains Jesus boiling in excrement, advice on deceiving and defrauding Gentiles, but otherwise largely pedantic nonsense and hair-splitting over precise interpretation of the Jewish law, with all sorts of exceptions, sometimes meant to fool their own God. These recent TikToks where they come out with ridiculous schemes to do something during Sabbath without it supposedly being work are a nice example. Reproductive selection pressure specifically favored those most capable of inventing such justification and excuses, further selecting for female cognition and associated verbal intelligence. Messianism was retained, the supposed Messiah to be a warlord who would bring about the victory over and submission of the Gentile nations, and there have been a few failed attempts by supposed Messiah, most famously Simon Bar Kokhba. In the early 7th century, Islam emerges as a reaction to power vacuum created by wars of Eastern Empire and Persia. Again justifies itself by being the one true interpretation of the message revealed to the line of Adam all the way to Jesus, while calling Christians stupid for believing in the Trinity and in God sinking so low as to produce a human son. They proceed on a rampage across North Africa, Middle East, Eastern Asia, murdering, pillaging, enslaving, raping, taking war brides, and making inroads into Europe as far north as France and as far east as Philippines, having precedent for this murderous ideology clearly set in the Old Testament. The myth of Islamic Golden Age persists to this day, and to the extent it's true, it's exclusively a product of stolen wealth, of books that they didn't burn, and of Spartan Persian converts. It was never a paradise for common people living under it or anywhere nearby. Europe was eventually able to organize enough resistance to drive Muslims out of Europe and go on the offensive via crusades. As a strategy, Islam is today thought of as masculine by the likes of Andrew Tate, delusion created purely out of Islam being violent and seemingly keeping women down. In fact, women are internally the biggest enforcers of the Islamic norms. All the feminine coercion of previous Abrahamic religions is still there. Universalism of Christianity persists, with anyone technically being able to convert into it, but with obvious significant differences in length, Muslims will go to promote this, genocide being just as good as the alternative, so long as no non-Muslims remain. Motivation is provided once again by a false promise of afterlife, but this time consisting of eternal sexual access to 72 beautiful virgins. They further managed to develop an extremely feminine philosophy that doesn't even recognize causality. While there were some attempts to modernize Islam among the more civilized people such as Persians, now Iranians, the radical and primitive dogmatic element tends to win. Jews, while often on the receiving end, along with Christians, Hindus and Buddhists, kept looking for opportunities to profit from fostering the conflict, playing both sides against each other and getting involved in Mediterranean slave trade. Jewish coexistence with European Christians in general has been characterized by them trying to corrupt their morals, bait them into the hazard of addiction such as alcoholism, and use of exorbitant and compound interests on loans with property seizure as a result of unpaid loans, while Christians themselves are unable to practice interest lending. There's at least some evidence that blood libel, accusation of ritualistic murder of Christians, wasn't false, possibly an example of North African converts maintaining their Canaanite tradition of child sacrifice. Far too often the church would protect Jews accused of these crimes and subject to violent response from the peasants, as did royalty that was happy to obtain tax revenue via middlemen. Every now and then conditions would become intolerable enough that Jews get exiled. The disloyalty and negative influence of the Jews, along with discovery of the Talmud, eventually makes even the church recognize the problem, which, along with heresy and apostasy, which means leaving the faith, culminates in Inquisition, Catholic ideological enforcement. In Spain and Portugal in 16th and 17th century, this was primarily motivated by growing influence of crypto-Jews, Jews who have outwardly converted to Christianity, usually due to being forced to, but sometimes merely due to figuring out the benefits of having access to all the networks accessible to Christians while still inwardly keeping the Jewish law and acting for the benefit of the Jews. Some have gone on to marry into aristocracies and gain influence by doing so, a feminine hypergamy in action. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas produced his magnum opus Summa Theologica that reintegrates work of the ancients, especially Aristotle, back into European thought and successfully combines natural law with the scripture, explaining God's commands as laws designed by a rational lawgiver for the good of the community, rather than as totalitarian commands that they were. He may have unknowingly doomed European Christianity by doing this, as Abrahamism doesn't survive under scrutiny of causality. The church is meanwhile undergoing schisms with theological disputes on the surface and power struggles underlying them. First-rate schism in the 11th century, where the Eastern Orthodoxy is getting away from the papal impositions. Among the interesting differences in theology is the Eastern Church openly acknowledging Christianity's Platonic heritage, while Catholics maintain Christianity's origin as entirely Jewish. This same ideology, taken to its conclusion, would motivate more schisms, revolutions, states abandoning papal dominion, and rather obvious corruption of the Church in the West, justified by dissents of Wycliffe, Hus, Luther, and Calvin, among the theological complaints ironically being recent insertions of Greek philosophy that have nothing to do with scripture into Church's theology, as well as the pagan-like traditions and institutions inherited from the Romans. Actions of Protestant revolutionaries, beginning with Hussites, were once again reminiscent of those of Critias and of Christians in the Roman Empire, once again destroying the symbols of the old faith. Hussites, like the church before them, considered themselves a new Israel, meaning new chosen people, and got inspired by Old Testament Israelite cruelty and intolerance, and just like Israelites, believed that no action that promotes interests of this new Israel and correct belief can be wrong. The Catholic Church was seen as a new Babylon and Jan Žižka as a reincarnation of Joshua. Jews collaborated with the Hussites and Hus himself, just like in subsequent Protestant revolutions. These Jews viewed the Catholic Church as oppressive to them and wanted to bring about more beneficial conditions for themselves. Hussites would go on to create parallel societies on the hills, naming them Tabor after biblical Mount Tabor, with radical egalitarianism, no private property, nudism, and sexual liberation, in many ways resembling Spartans. And science movement involved many peasants who stopped tilling their fields, not pursuing the revolution to its end ceased to be an option. And victims who had their houses burned had no option but to join, often buying into the promises of utopia without violence, class differences, and property, where power to make decisions would lie in the hands of common people, sin would cease to exist, and heaven would exist on earth. Hussite revolution failed after the loss of tactical genius of Žižka, himself in the revolution more out of anti-German sentiment rather than sharing in the utopian belief, but subsequent Protestant revolution succeeded. In the 16th century, Isaac Luria would produce the Lurianic Kabbalah, which contains the concept of tikkun olam, meaning healing the world, which in practice means transforming the world for Jewish benefit. This isn't a new concept, it's merely putting into different words what Jews have already been doing the whole time as part of Yahweh's pact. Following the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century, revolutions attained justifications via very different materialistic false promises, and yet in practice much was identical. French revolutionaries were motivated by the ideology of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, arguing private property is the source of inequality, equality itself necessary for liberty, and some general will of the people, which would in practice once again be ideological conformity. Robespierre was effectively in the role of Critias, chopping off the heads of everyone who didn't go along with his program. The Republican regime tried to eliminate the old Catholic religion, replacing it with artificial religion of reason worship and even instituting a new calendar. After the failure of the new French regime, Napoleon takes power and assembles Grand Sanhedrin, a Jewish court, to answer his questions about whether Jews can be assimilated into French society. Rabbis lie to him and are rewarded with Jews being granted citizenship and getting freed in every territory Napoleon conquers, for which he is declared another Messiah before he gets defeated. An event that proved to be very profitable for Nathan Rothschild in Britain due to clearing out the guild market after getting early news about Napoleon's defeat. Here again they played both sides as they would in many subsequent conflicts, demonstrating once again their only loyalties to themselves. The influence of enfranchised Jews grew everywhere thanks to their international networking and new ability to acquire more wealth than ever before. Throughout 18th and 19th century there was a Jewish movement Haskalah, a Jewish enlightenment, which involved outwardly acting as regular members of society, though like crypto-Jews in Portugal and Spain before, this involved no internal change in strategy. The consistent ethical question remained, is it good for the Jews? These Reformed Jews tried to portray Baruch Spinoza as one of the most important figures of the Enlightenment, even though he was previously ostracized from the synagogue, wasn't seen as a remarkable philosopher, and nothing about this philosophy was particularly Jewish, mostly being similar to Descartes. In fact, in his theological political treatise, he identifies Yahweh as Jewish tribal God. The Jews are kept in existence by their hatred of all other people and disputing their chosenness, showing why he was ostracized. This is part of a larger program to portray Jews as a uniquely intelligent and moral nation, and that Judaism is a moral beacon for the rest of humanity. Now actively involved in Gentile politics, they start advocating secularism and tolerance that would remove all obstacles in their way. The Russian Bolshevik Revolution was motivated by similar reasoning as the French one, along with some economic pseudoscience of Karl Marx and the oppression narrative of capitalists versus proletariat. Unlike previous revolutions between Gentiles, this one involves actual Jews with grievances towards the Tsarist regime and using the new promise of communist utopia as an excuse to get into power. Lenin being again the new Critias, with Trotsky's permanent revolution being a new version of Tikkun Olam, intended to bring about communist revolution across the whole world. Soviet Russia would subsequently adopt anti-racist policies and sexual liberation at a time when these were still unthinkable positions in the West, but over time had to push at least the latter back as it proved unworkable, as did its Marxist economic policies, leading to adoption of some level of market economy. In place of Plato's guardians or the Inquisition, it had KGB to maintain ideological conformity. Mao's later revolution would yet again fit the same format as the previous ones, with explicit effort to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And just like in Soviet Russia, the extremes had to eventually be abandoned, and China today would be much more accurately described as a fascist country with communist political formula justifying the regime. On the American side, revolution was occurring comparatively slowly. Founding fathers were largely deists who'd leave Abrahamism behind if they had the option. Jefferson edited his own version of the Bible that consisted of life and teachings of Jesus, purged of any supernatural content. And Thomas Paine, in his The Age of Reason, analyzes the Bible and comes to much the same conclusion about Old Testament's Yahweh as Gnostics and Marcion before. They had to accept the population that they had, however, and so enshrined separation of church and state at the federal level as a compromise to enable coexistence of various Protestant sects, as well as Catholics, something that would later be abused to invite in and protect completely alien and hostile religions. While Puritans brought in delusional utopian notions of equality and unity of different classes and races that were a major contribution to justifications for the unnecessary bloody civil war, these largely died out in the early 20th century as the Darwinistic explanation for inequality won the debate. At this time, large number of Jewish immigrants start arriving, many with communist views and Soviet sympathies, bringing their capital with them, and start meddling in politics as they were already doing in the British Empire, contributing to the involvement in two disastrous world wars despite the popular isolationist sentiment among the native population, which leads to Soviets controlling half of Europe and British Empire falling apart. America becomes the global superpower, and every ideological development that follows would later infect the rest of the West, if not the world. One of these would be Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, a discipline that poses as a scientific psychology but is for the most part just feminine psychologizing, attributing false motives, making absurd connections, sexualizing children, justifying irresponsibility, and much of this clearly motivated by Freud's self-interests and interests of his tribe. Frankfurt School that moved to America during interwar years, involving figures such as Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse, work along similar lines, explaining what, according to them, went wrong in Germany as a product of a German nature, explained as authoritarian personality disorder, and after the war would start a process of denazification of West Germany with the approval of the US government. Authoritarian personality disorder included such things as high investment parenting, not being promiscuous, and basically any expression of masculinity. Far from stopping with Germans, this ideology would be imposed on America, with the rest of the West following. The entire European culture gets the blame, with various founding myths to go along with it. Holocaust, ignoring Jewish role in impoverishing the Germans in Weimar Republic and destroying their culture. Colonialism, with similarly inflated numbers of supposed victims, ignoring how the colonized countries were improved by institutions and infrastructure introduced by Europeans. Slavery that ignored the global context of everyone practicing it, Europeans and Americans themselves not being involved in actual enslaving, treating slaves far better than anyone else, and being the first ones to free the slave, even as it still remains practiced in parts of the world today. Karl Popper invented the idea of open society, and while he correctly identified totalitarianism of Plato's philosophy, his motivation was to excuse other modern totalitarian movements that heavily involved his own tribe. Popper would criticize conspiracy theories where powerful people are responsible for the ills of society because, according to him, nothing comes of as intended. Claiming power of the state in a liberal democracy isn't for harming opponents. Yet this is exactly what he justifies against the opponents of liberal democracy. Popper's paradox of tolerance, where everything must be tolerated except what's deemed intolerant, is a completely incoherent justification of simply getting rid of ideas that go against the regime which poses itself as tolerant and rational. Evidently, Popper's desired open society is no less closed than Plato's. It just favors his own ideas and his own ethnic group. Next, we have a pseudo-scientific blank slatism of Franz Boas, Stephen Jay Gould, and Richard Levontin, who basically lied about observed race differences like skull sizes, or producing a fallacious argument about individuals between different races often being more genetically similar than within one race. These justifications would eventually be widely adopted and used for justifying the 60s revolutions, with large role played by NAACP, a Jewish advocacy organization outwardly posing as acting in the interest of Black Americans. However, the only figureheads they supported would be the likes of the communist Martin Luther King, who, with speeches written by his Jewish supporters, advocated for Black inclusion in white society without any responsibility for Black behavior that made whites want to dissociate in the first place. Figures like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, who advocated separation and independence or repatriation into Africa, were undermined. The result was the Civil Rights Act that ensured white people can have no spaces reserved for themselves, and their only legal means of defense, wherever effects of diversity are felt, is to move away before diversity would inevitably follow after them, rinse and repeat. This was made much worse by the passing of the Hart-Celler Act that overturned the popular policy of preserving the ethnic makeup of America, instead letting in anyone who'd work regardless of effects on shared culture, trust, or sense of community. Civil rights would justify entitlements to any group that could conceivably be thought of as disadvantaged due to some perceived prejudice or historical injustice, which in practice produce a hierarchy that puts everyone above white men. Equality of the sexes followed this same logic. The first wave feminism of high-agency women may have been misguided, but only from the second wave feminism with Jewish women like Gloria Steinem taking over did it acquire character very reminiscent of Judaism, with the goal being female supremacy and men in their service, while externally presenting itself as merely being concerned with equality and justice. Feminists enforce conformity of behavior among women that is undesirable to men, because women that are desirable to men have a strong incentive to defect from feminism. Hence, advice on cutting hair, getting piercing, tattoos, being bossy, etc. Sexual liberation would justify total irresponsibility and remove connection between sex and family, with the result, as we see today, being not only fewer people forming families than ever, but also fewer people having sex than ever. Gay rights fights again follow the same pattern as the others, ignoring correlations between various sexual and behavioral disorders, presenting typical gay people as perfectly well-adjusted and responsible individuals, with the result of their legal equality demonstrating nothing could be further from the truth. Lesbianism was equated with male homosexuality, even though in most cases it really is just a phase and experimentation rather than something a woman is born with. This has recently been taken even farther with the restored transgender ideology of Weimar Republic that states there's something called gender independent of sex and that one could be born in the wrong body. What is this that's born in the wrong body is never explained by these people who reject any notion of soul as completely irrational. For explicit Jewish advocacy, there's ADL, originally founded to posthumously defend the murderer, Leo Frank, via pressuring the media, business, advertisers, now calling anyone opposing Jewish goals as an anti-Semite. or the nominal right-wing former Trotskyists who realized communism isn't going to work out in their favor developed the ideology of neoconservatism, a thinly veiled Zionism that employs seemingly conservative justifications to use resources and lives of Americans for Israel's interests in the Middle East. In light of the origin of most modern Jews as Canaanites and original Hebrews staying exactly where they were all along, their descendants going through conversions to Christianity and Islam, and today being known as Palestinians, the support of propagandized evangelicals is especially ironic. Canaanites are driving Hebrews out of the Promised Land. So this is where we are today, the so-called liberal democracy that supposedly makes us freer than ever. It is neither liberal nor democratic, but a totalitarian Abrahamist regime running on a utopian ideology of total liberation from biological realities of race and sex differences, from responsibility, from family, any tribal loyalties, from all the things that make people stronger. All this presented as scientifically supported with modern priests called scientific experts. Any deviation from the narrative pathologized as some sort of disorder, irrational prejudice, phobia, or ism. This is heavily policed by intelligence agencies, financed by Jewish control of Federal Reserve, BlackRock, and Vanguard, censored via controlled social media, propagandized by control over mainstream media, and by Hollywood presenting myths and history with completely inverted moral values to disgust and demoralize the segment of population that disagrees. Extreme levels of replacement, migration, and impoverishment happening alongside all this, with release valves of video games, porn, and completely useless right-wing parties. All this imposed on the entire Western world with the obvious goal of disempowering European people as a fulfillment of the covenant invented in Alexandria over 2 millennia ago. My goal here was to show these different movements and ideologies throughout history were in most respects one and the same thing, often but not always led by the same tribe with the same goal. Common aspects across all these different versions of Abrahamism are then seduction with false promise of freedom from laws of nature, usually human nature, and of some utopia that will come about when people in the way are converted or removed. There's typically some myth of oppression that denies incentives involved, and especially how behavior of the oppressed contributes to how they're treated, inventing false heroes and false martyrs. People involved are generally feminine population that buys into those promises and myths. It's particularly attractive to individuals undesirable in regular markets for association, production, or reproduction, as they cannot obtain value by providing value to others, and so being part of some network where the only value they need to provide is to agree with some ideology that they don't even need to understand, and feeling undeserved sense of superiority for doing so is a very attractive prospect for them. The incentive for the group is then to keep them undesirable to prevent their defection. The ideologies are universalist in the sense that they're to be applied everywhere and transform the world. It's not tied to any particular territory, territoriality being a masculine instinct, even when one is specified as a homeland as it is in Judaism. This is a totally opposite of the European strategy of self-determination by self-determined means. Internally, it's dominated by connected and verbally skilled elites capable of providing the most elaborate justifications and excuses. It's a meritocracy of sorts, but only in the sense of attaining and using status and influence, not in producing any real-world results beyond this. Feminine means of coercion are used to maintain an ideological conformity. Outsiders are viewed at best as means to an end and never as equals or true allies, deserving of reciprocity. If opportunity allows, they are to be turned into a helot equivalent or exterminated. Abrahamists outside of power will make appeals to liberty, tolerance, individualism, and equality, or whatever values of the dominant groups are, to expand their access to resources and sphere of influence to bring about conditions for revolution. Revolutions either occur fast when enough supporters exist to overthrow the previous regime, or slowly march through the institutions and replacing previous elites, and always involve an effort to wipe off the past and introduce a fictional one that justifies the new order. Abrahamists in power will not grant the group they deprived of power any of the privileges they themselves demanded, and will instead start censoring them and persecuting them, even while still portraying themselves as the underdogs and victims, accusing the other of what they are themselves doing. They usually either don't hold on to power for long, deviating from reality too much, or at least, where Gentiles are involved, eventually reinterpret the ideology pragmatically to make it compatible with what works in the real world, which is why subsequent generations can think of an originally revolutionary ideology and system based on it as somehow conservative and traditional, as we see with Christianity and Islam, and even some older versions of civil rights ideology. On the other hand, as long as radicals can hold on to power and maintain fanaticism in their subjects, they've been consistently able to punch above their weight. The question at the end of this is, how do we resist and fight this, and how do we immunize ourselves? Why I won't be answering this here, beyond hopefully helping you identify an Abrahamic ideology. The major goal of our work is precisely this, and so hopefully other presenters here, along with the rest of our available material, will provide some answers. And contrary to what it may seem, I'm also not anti-Christian. I'm just honest about Christianity's origins and effects on European civilization. I recognize that it had an important part to play in our history, some of it good, and I recognize today conservative Christians are in the role of the pagans, and revolutionary woke ideology is in the role of Christianity back in the Roman Empire. I propose that if Christianity is to survive as part of European civilization, it must emphasize everything that's European about it and reject all of its Abrahamic baggage. Yes. That's it. Thank you.
So, I was trained as an art critic, and so as an art critic, you only point out faults. Does that make sense? That doesn't make any sense, but that's
Come again?
I was trained my formal training is actually in art criticism, right? And so the problem with being trained in art criticism is the way you show you actually paid attention is because you identified something wrong.
Okay.
It's critique. Well, I mean, the problem is we have criticism and we have critique, and now Luke, they've conquered the word critique, right? As in critique now means Abrahamic undermining. It's hard to use the word anymore. So the only thing I was, first of all, I could not have told that story. That was brilliantly done and in great detail, and you did it with the compassion I was thrilled with. The only thing I noticed is that you didn't cover the baiting of the Jews themselves by the Egyptians, because you mentioned how they were the hill people, right? They weren't exactly they were the outcasts in that part of the country, that part of the region, and the Egyptians trained them to help administration, taxation, etc., which is they learned their literacy and
that is news to me.
You didn't know that? Okay, so what happened is that they used the Jews against the locals.
Oh, I remember you mentioning
right?
those things before.
So this is where so they got taught as a weapon of sedition, a group advantage that they have played since then. So and they played that same advantage against the people of Europe or anywhere else they went, which is the alliance of the group with the state against the people.
Yes, that's what the narrative of Joseph in Egypt is about.
Correct. So the only thing I found missing from that, which is to say, well, where does this come from? See, I thought you did a better job than anyone. I don't know what books you got that out of. I thought you did a great job of showing it's not. We have this tendency to think that Judaism, that the scriptures are older than the Greek thought. It's not true.
Well, main guy to thank for this is Rurik Skywalker. You can find him on Substack. And his own source is Russell Mirkin. He compares Plato and the Old Testament.
This is, I don't know, so I was curious where you got it from. It's not that people haven't said this for a long time. It's that you just told the story really concretely and clearly, so thank you. But I felt like we need to make the point there that the Jews were trained by the Egyptians in monetary manipulation and predation upon neighbors, which caused them to be even further outcast, which created further utility for them to maintain in-group, which made further utility of an in-group, especially one that exists through parasitism. And so you take that population, and it's the opposite end of the gypsies. And between the gypsies as pure parasites and criminals, and the Jews on the other end, at the high end of it, you have the people in the middle who are the producers. And so the problem Western civilization faces is we're highly productive. Well, all other civilizations face is that we're productive, and we have to keep the productive people productive. That's what our norms, traditions, institutions do as a further production, innovation, advancement. Theirs don't. They specialize in the use of baiting into hazard to obtain an unearned profit that allows them to conflict by the externalization of the cost of that unearned profit.
Yeah, and this is, of course, all perfectly moral in their minds.
Well, the problem is we don't because we. The European tradition is sovereignty of the individual. So we're always protecting individual free will, individual free choice. But what if you're baited into hazard and you don't know enough or you're impulsive enough, right? That overcomes. So we don't bait each other into hazard, but they do.
Well, I suppose that opens up the question of what exactly does free will mean and where are the limits.
Well, I mean, okay, I don't want to get into that. That's another whole thing. The point being that we allow you to make your mistakes in life and learn from them because we don't punish failure. But what they do is they bait you into the hazard. That's what financialism is, and that's what the whole hierarchy of false promises. It's a false promise of salvation from the physical, natural, and evolutionary laws of the universe, and the logical, obviously, postmodernism. It's freedom from those laws of the universe so that they can use social construction to manipulate you into a position where they can obtain the authority by which to extract from you.
Could you go over the part about Christianity and why you said so many Europeans basically converted into it? I know you went over that. If you could go over that a little bit more.
Well, it's basically it's a Greek heroic myth, but with somewhat changed values, of course. But the values are still a total opposite of Judaism, because it's universalistic, that in a sense of actually being inclusive to everyone, and you're not supposed to bait people into hazard and stuff like that.
So we talked about the Library of Alexandria. From what we understand, what was the contents of that?
Everything.
Right. But what was the majority of the contents of it? The majority content was commentary on the epic cycle. What's the epic cycle? It's what's mostly lost, but we know it is the Greek mythical structure, specifically the trials and tribulations of Odysseus and those of Achilles, right? But those are only two pieces of a long cycle. So we had our Bible. What happened to that Bible? They burned it. What happened to the commentaries on our Bible? They burned it. Who is Achilles? He's the hero we're supposed to learn how to be parental aristocrats. We're supposed to learn that you forgive Priam and you let him take his son.
Yeah, I mean, if you want continuity of values, you will find them more between Iliad and New Testament than between Old One and New One.
That's right. And so what they did is, and I thought you covered this brilliantly. What they did is they looked at this Bible, right? They created a new one, which you've already mentioned, and they burned the other Bible, and they destroyed the arts, the institutions, the letters. They killed the philosophers or ostracized them.
Yeah, but that was Christians, right?
Well, but okay, right? So that's true. But I mean, is that baiting those people into a hazard? Right? Yes. The second thing is, there is if you took Jesus like Jefferson did as a philosopher, burn all the other stuff. Take Jesus as a philosopher, and you did make what he did in the Jefferson Bible. You have somebody who says basically, the aristocratic civilization is superior. Here's what they're doing. Here's how the lower classes can do it. So what Jesus gave is he turned a civilization in which there were aristocratic classes and women and serfs and slaves, right? And he turned that into these people now can have virtue equivalent to the aristocratic virtue by doing no harm instead of heroic good.
Right, I forgot to bring that up. That was missing in the European religion before.
Dude, look what you covered. You expect me to not find something to contribute to it? I mean, it was brilliant. So I would say that the 2 points I've tried to make here are, the one is that you have to understand that Jews themselves were baited into the hazard of creating a civilization that survives on baiting into hazard, right? And the second thing is that the bad part of Christianity is this attempt to turn it into a subversion, which is what you were making the point, when Jesus was actually saying, here's this aristocratic civilization. They don't do this shit to each other. Here's how you cannot do this shit to each other.
Yeah, that might have been from the influence that was trying to domesticate the Jews and integrate them.
And the Germanics even re-added the heroic requirements for the aristocratic class again. Mm-hmm. And so we have the medieval Christianity. If you're a peasant, don't hurt anybody. And if you're an aristocrat, hurt the right people.
Well, I mean, yeah. This is fascinating. So this starts out as seditionists spreading Christianity, right? Just like seditionists spread the Marxist sequence, right? This is how it starts. And so they're doing it to undermine, right? They're building followers to undermine the heroic narrative, just like the Marxist sequence is trying to undermine the heroic narrative today. Why do we have a heroic narrative? Because it generates commons. How does the West outcompete other civilizations? By the productions of commons. This is why we jokingly in groups say, in our group, we say, well, the West lives on not communism, but commonsism, which turns out to be the opposite strategy, which is put all your surpluses in the production of commons, which reduce everybody's costs, rather than take from people and give to people that normalize the difference.
So no wonder libertarians don't like you.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a heretic. Now I forgot the point I was making. What did I start out with? Yeah, I went before that. Oh, okay, so they started out with the seditions coming in. But what occurred over time was that when you get women underneath you, which is what they did, because Christianity was really a feminine household religion where you went to the house and they served food, and that was where it was built. It was similar to the male version was the Mithras stuff, and so they took that model, they brought it in-house and made it feminine. Then there was enough accumulation of power by these seditionists over these women that it became a status opportunity for men. What happened in our academy? Same thing. Now women are the dominant participants in the academy in the non-sciences. So they did the exact same thing again to us.
Well, it's also happening in the sciences, turning them into non-sciences.
That's the momentum problem. So what happened, though, is as Rome fell, we had feudalism and we went from centralization to distributed government again. And the result was the aristocracy started using the church, putting their men in the church, right? And the church became a holding company for the aristocracies. So the church couldn't convert the aristocracies except as an administrative rule for managing their labor force, the serfs, the peasantry. And the aristocracies maintained Germanic militarism, which is why you have the Middle Ages, right, for the long period of the Middle Ages. So we had a balance of Christianization of German and the Christianity and the classical European Germanic aristocratic tradition. And so what happened is the aristocracy had captured the church. By the time we get to the late Middle Ages, the church, which is basically, think of it as, what are the big financial... Bryan, why is it escaping me? The guys who put lots of money together and to create what? Hedge funds. So basically the church is a hedge fund. They own 50% of the land in Europe. They make all their money by leasing it out. Why did they do that? Under primogeniture in the aristocracy, the older son inherits. So what do you do with the other ones? You put them into the church and they make money from the land. And what are they? So what's the difference? There's nothing. The church is aristocratically captured. And so they have a divided loyalty between the local aristocracy, local manorialism, local aristocracy, and the church, which legitimates their position. Did I make my point yet? It was captured by the church. This allowed to the... Go ahead and laugh at me. I laugh at myself. Why not? So what happened is the Germanization of Christianity. There's a great book called The Germanization of Christianity, which you should read. You have it in your phone. So you get this Germanization of it. So what we call Christianity is like, okay, there's Jesus who comes up with this idea, whether it existed or not. Somebody came up with an idea. We got to copy these Europeans, because we got to stop doing this stuff to each other. Then some people got together and said, hey, let's turn this into a seditionist movement to war against the Europeans like the Marxists did. Right? And this whole thing expands, and it finally gets captured. Can we capture this thing?
All right, so I'm a little bit scatterbrained. Let me see if I can piece this question together. So you mentioned the Founding Fathers. A little bit. You mentioned the Founding Fathers. I can't tell if this is working or not. Okay. The Founding Fathers kind of compromised in the original creation of the Constitution so that they could include the polity of the Christians. My question is, with a possibility of a new Constitution being made, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, how does Christianity as it is now reconcile with that, and what is to be done, if anything, or do we make a similar compromise and simply, self-determination by self-determined means?
Well, we may have to do that to some extent, maybe state by state. It would just be an exception to rules of testimony. Or if your religion is Abrahamic, you will have no political influence. But I believe the Abrahamized Christianity can exist too, folkish Christianity.
So Jefferson tried. He wrote the Jefferson Bible. He took the Abrahamism out of the story of Jesus of Nazareth. We have an attempt. He did it. I think he tried twice. Right, the second one is the one we have. And so he said, if you were to say, what does Christian mean? Is it believing in imitating the behavior of Jesus Christ? Then if that's Christianity, that's great. If you want to say there's a God and the behavior of that God is actually Indo-European, or maybe Greek, it's the order of the universe, then that's compatible. But if you have to bring in the Abrahamic method of deception in order to tell that story, then it's no longer a virtuous Christianity. So the question is, how can you tell these stories? And of course, the defender of the stories is what's his name? Peterson, right? I can't figure out whether I want to kill him or love him. Is that he's defending? So there are parables. Adam and Eve is a great story. There's a lot of parables, but you have to launder all this evil God out of it and launder all the lying out of it. I mean, who's asking me about Cain and Abel the other day, and I'm like, do you understand what it's the agrarians versus the herders? Right? You understand what's going on there, and that's why it makes no sense. And so if you get rid of Job, you brought up Job, I think. Did you bring up Job? Was it you that brought up Job?
Only as an example of how God is not to be questioned.
Which is wrong, right? You question the laws of the universe until you understand how to apply them. So to my view is, and I had this is the hardest problem I worked on. And people think you solve truth. No, there's nothing compared to trying to decompose Christianity. It's absolutely a vital part of our civilization. It works. Yeah, I know. I got another minute here.
Even when I'm doing a presentation, Curt is getting the warning.
If you can't see the people in the video can't see, I just got the 5-minute sign from the director, and so I lost my train of thought. What was I talking? Oh, Job. So you're trying to get rid of all the evil that's in there. And all that evil is creating submission instead of responsibility. And what's the difference between aristocracy and slavery? Submission versus responsibility. And so we get rid of the bad in that. We've got Christianity that endures. If we don't, this current curve of decline of Christianity will reach its natural point, which is under 20%, because only a certain percentage of the population is both neurotic enough and empathic enough to be able to overcome the competition between reason and their need for mindfulness by that method.
I'm happy for them to have some sort of religion. Just prefer if it wasn't an Abrahamized one.
That's the thing is we're stuck in this model where we think religion means the three Abrahamic religions. It doesn't. It's just a means of producing mindfulness, so we all follow vaguely the same moral intuitions, so that we can cooperate without trying to kill each other because we're super predators. I mean, I don't want to fight people like this big guy back here. It scares me.
The point here is that that Abrahamism completely deviates from what religion meant to everyone before that. It's Plato's project. It's not religion.
That's right.
And I would say Christianity did become a religion, but that's alongside that project.
Yes.
All right.